Chapter 1. The Anatomy of the Dark. There is a fundamental mystery that sits at the very center of the human experience. Whenever we turn on the evening news or scan the morning headlines or even hear a piece of quiet gossip in our own neighborhoods about someone doing something unthinkable, a singular question immediately rises to our lips. We look at the wreckage of a shattered life, a ruined career, or a devastated community, and we ask ourselves who could possibly be responsible for such a thing. We are obsessed with the identity of the actor. We want a name, a face, a tangible villain we can point to and lock away in our minds. But asking who committed an act is actually starting at the wrong end of the maze. If you truly want to understand human nature, if you want to decipher the darkest and most perplexing actions of your fellow human beings, you must realize that identity is merely the final destination. The only path that will ever lead you there is paved by a much deeper, much more profound question. You must ask why. Behavior reflects personality. This is the absolute unbreakable law of human nature. Every action we take, from the way we meticulously organize our desks to the way we react when a driver cuts us off in traffic, leaves a psychological fingerprint. We are constantly broadcasting who we are to the world. When a person steps over the line of societal norms and commits a destructive act, that act does not happen in a vacuum. It is the physical manifestation of an internal reality. The wreckage left behind is a perfect, unvarnished mirror of the mind that caused it. Therefore, if we can understand the motivation behind the behavior, we can reverse engineer the personality of the person responsible. We can look at the how and the why, and eventually the who will reveal itself with startling clarity. To truly understand how this works in the real world, imagine a quiet, tree-lined suburban street. A family returns home from a weekend vacation to find their back door shattered and hanging off its hinges. They walk inside, their hearts pounding in their chests, and find their home violated. The large flat-screen television is gone from the living room wall. In the bedroom, the heavy wooden jewelry box has been emptied of every gold chain and silver ring. The laptop computer that usually sits on the study desk is missing. The police are called, an investigation is launched, and within a few weeks the culprits are caught. They are two young men from the other side of town who are deeply in debt and looking for a quick, easy score. They pawned the television, sold the jewelry for a fraction of its worth, and used the money to pay off what they owed. This is a crime of opportunity and enterprise. It is a violation, and the family will feel the sting of that intrusion for a long time, but the motivation is entirely rational. We all understand greed. We all understand the desire for quick cash. The young men never wanted to hurt anyone. They merely wanted the valuable items inside the house. Once caught, they are terrified of the consequences and desperate to avoid prison. Now, imagine a second house, just 2 streets over, broken into a month later. A woman returns home from a long day at the office. She finds her back door forced open in exactly the same manner as the first house. The glass is broken, the lock is defeated. She steps inside, her breath catching in her throat, expecting the worst. But the television is still sitting quietly in the living room. She walks cautiously into the study, and her expensive laptop is still sitting exactly where she left it. Confused, she makes her way down the hall to her bedroom. Her jewelry box is completely untouched. But when she looks at her dresser, she sees that the bottom drawer has been pulled completely out and dumped on the floor. The only things missing from her entire home are a few specific pieces of her personal, unwashed clothing. On a standard police blotter, both of these incidents are logged under the exact same criminal statute. Both are cases of breaking and entering. Both involve the theft of personal property. But to someone who understands the anatomy of motive, these two events exist in entirely different universes of human behavior. The first intrusion was a nuisance, driven by a simple external need for money. The second intrusion is a screaming, flashing alarm bell. The second intruder did not break into that house for financial gain. He ignored thousands of dollars worth of easily pawned electronics. He took clothing. But he is not stealing fabric. He is stealing a fantasy. He is taking a deeply personal piece of a human being to use in his own mind, a token to help him manipulate, dominate, and control a woman who does not even know he exists. This action tells us a profound story about his personality. It tells us that he is driven by a dark internal obsession that simple theft cannot satisfy. He crossed a massive psychological boundary to enter that home, risking prison not for money but to feed an emotional sickness. And because we understand that why, we know something terrifying about who he is. he is not going to stop. The stolen clothing will only satisfy his fantasy for a short time. Eventually, the fantasy will require a living, breathing participant. The behavior will escalate, and if he is not identified and stopped, he will return to take much more than fabric. This same principle applies not just to hidden, secretive acts, but to the most visible and catastrophic public tragedies. Think of a community shattered by an unthinkable act of mass violence. Imagine a man walking into a crowded community center, a place of safety and innocence, with the sole intent of causing devastation, knowing full well he will not leave the building alive. When the unthinkable happens, the community is left reeling in shock. The neighbors of the perpetrator almost always say the same thing. They say he was quiet. They say he kept to himself. They say they never saw it coming, and they endlessly ask why he would do such a terrible thing to people he hardly knew. But if we look closely, the behavior tells the story of the personality, and the act is never truly random. This individual is completely different from a predator who hunts in the shadows and expects to slip away into the night to strike again. This person is playing an endgame strategy. He is a collector of grievances. For years, perhaps his entire life, he has felt invisible, marginalized, and deeply inadequate. He has likely felt that the world owes him a certain level of respect, success, or attention that it stubbornly refuses to pay. He has probably tried to voice these frustrations before. He has written angry, rambling letters to local newspapers or lodged endless petty complaints with the city council. He has stewed in a toxic, suffocating belief that he is a victim of a society that refuses to acknowledge his worth. When he finally reaches a breaking point, when he feels completely ignored and utterly powerless, he decides to force the world to look at him. He chooses a target like a community center, not necessarily out of a specific personal hatred for the individuals inside, but because those individuals represent the society that he believes rejected him. The act of violence is an assertion of absolute power from a man who has felt completely powerless his entire life. He knows he cannot escape, and he does not want to. He will not give society the satisfaction of putting him on trial and judging him. He wants to dictate the final terms of his existence, leaving a scar on the world that cannot be ignored. The motivation is a toxic cocktail of inadequacy, grandiosity, and a desperate thirst for revenge. Every action, no matter how chaotic or senseless it appears on the surface, follows a deeply ingrained internal logic. The person committing the act always has a reason that makes perfect sense to them in the moment. Our job, if we want to understand the people around us and protect the things we hold dear, is to learn how to read that logic. We must learn to look past the surface of the event and stare directly into the engine of the behavior. We must completely surrender to the question of why. But this twisted logic does not appear overnight. A person does not simply wake up one average Tuesday morning and decide to cross the line from a normal life into a world of predation and violence. The seeds of these actions are planted long before the harvest. They simmer in the dark, nurtured by deeply flawed coping mechanisms and runaway fantasies. To truly grasp the anatomy of motive, we have to travel back to the beginning. We have to look at how a mind slowly turns against the light, how a predator is slowly constructed piece by piece, and how the earliest warning signs are so often ignored. Chapter 2. The Making of a Predator. There is a comforting lie we tell ourselves as a society. When a person commits a truly heinous predatory act, we want to believe they are fundamentally different from the rest of us. We want to believe they are monsters, born with pitch-black souls, dropped into this world as fully formed engines of destruction. It is a protective mechanism, a way to keep the darkness at arm's length. But the terrifying, undeniable truth is that predators are not born. They are built, brick by brick, choice by choice. They are constructed in plain sight, often in our own neighborhoods, sitting in our own classrooms, and walking down our own streets. The journey from an innocent child to a violent offender is a slow, methodical evolution of the mind, and if we want to protect ourselves, we have to understand exactly how that evolution happens. If you trace the timeline of a violent predator back to its absolute beginning, you will almost always find a landscape of profound dysfunction. You will find homes completely devoid of warmth, environments defined by brutal physical abuse, terrifying emotional neglect, or the crushing absence of any stabilizing role models. These children grow up in a world where they are made to feel entirely powerless, insignificant, and out of control. Now, it is crucial to state that countless human beings endure unimaginable childhood suffering and grow up to become incredibly kind, contributing, deeply empathetic adults. They take their pain and channel it into a fierce determination to ensure no one else ever feels the way they did. They become protectors. So why does one child become a protector while another becomes a predator? The answer lies in how they choose to process their powerlessness. Instead of internalizing their pain and seeking to heal it, the developing predator looks for a way to externalize it. They discover a twisted psychological mathematics. If they are the ones causing pain to someone or something else, they are no longer the victim. They are in charge. This leads us to a specific cluster of early warning behaviors that professionals look for, a pattern of actions that show a young mind trying desperately to seize control of a chaotic world. Think of a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, living in a house where he is treated as invisible or worthless. He begins to wet the bed well past the age where it is developmentally appropriate. This is not simply a biological accident, it is often a subconscious physical rebellion, a manifestation of the deep, roiling anxiety and lack of control he feels during his waking hours. But bedwetting only brings shame, so he seeks a more active form of power. He goes out into the neighborhood and finds a stray animal, a dog, a cat, a bird with a broken wing. He does not try to help it. Instead, he subjects the animal to slow, deliberate cruelty. When you hear about a child harming an animal, you must understand what is actually happening in that child's mind. He is not just being mean, he is running an experiment. For the first time in his entire life, he has found something smaller, weaker, and more helpless than he is. As he manipulates that animal, he realizes that he holds the ultimate authority over its life and death. The rush he feels is intoxicating. It is the closest thing to a godlike power he has ever experienced, and it acts as a temporary balm for his own crushing feelings of inadequacy. Soon he discovers another tool for manipulation: fire. Imagine this same boy striking a match and dropping it into a dry patch of brush or a neighborhood dumpster. Within minutes, the flames roar, sirens wail in the distance, massive trucks with flashing lights arrive, and grown men, the very authority figures who normally ignore him or belittle him, are suddenly rushing around, shouting orders, completely reacting to a situation that he created. He stands quietly in the shadows, watching the chaos, feeling a massive surge of adrenaline. He is the invisible director of this entire dramatic production. This is what we call the feedback filter. The child learns that aggressive, destructive, antisocial behavior makes him feel powerful. Instead of feeling remorse for the damage he causes, he feels a deep, satisfying sense of accomplishment. The loop tightens. He begins to practice these behaviors, seeking out new and better ways to achieve that high. As this boy grows into a teenager, a massive psychological war begins to rage inside him. On one side is a deep, crippling sense of inadequacy. Despite his often high intelligence, he is an outsider. He cannot connect with his peers. He cannot maintain normal romantic relationships, and he feels like a perpetual loser. But on the other side of the battlefield is a soaring, delusional sense of grandiosity. He believes he is vastly superior to everyone around him, that the rules of normal society are beneath him, and that he is entitled to take whatever he wants. Because reality constantly proves his inadequacy and denies his grandiosity, he retreats into the only place where he is an undisputed king: his own mind. In any predatory crime, fantasy always precedes the act. The fantasy is the incubator. The young man begins to imagine scenarios where he is dominant, where he is successful, where the people who rejected him are forced to submit to his will. But a mind can only live on pure imagination for so long before it builds a tolerance. Eventually, the fantasy requires fuel from the real world. He might begin by walking through his neighborhood at night, staring through the windows of houses. He watches women going about their evening routines, completely unaware of his presence. He is not just looking, he is feeding on the power of observation without consent. He is an invisible ghost invading their most private sanctuary. But soon, the view from the outside is no longer enough. The tension builds. He slips through an unlocked window and steps into the house. He does not take money or electronics. He goes straight to a bedroom and steals a deeply personal item, perhaps a piece of undergarment or a photograph. He takes this token back to his own room. It is a physical anchor for his fantasies, a fetish object that allows him to relive the thrill of the intrusion over and over again. If you want to understand how this escalation reaches its terrifying peak, consider a grown man who has never managed to assimilate into adult society. He lives alone, working a menial job, holding on to a burning resentment against the world. In the privacy of his garage, he begins to construct elaborate, macabre scenes. He buys department store mannequins and meticulously alters them. He poses them in positions of utter degradation and subjugation, binding them with ropes, painting them to look terrified. He sets up lighting and takes hundreds of photographs of his creations, spending hours organizing them in hidden albums. To a casual observer, this might just look like the bizarre, harmless hobby of an eccentric loner. But if you understand the anatomy of motive, you know you are looking at a ticking time bomb. This man is not playing. He is rehearsing. He is perfecting his script. He is working out the logistical details of how to control a human body, how to elicit the exact visual representation of terror that his fantasy demands. He is practicing. And just as the window was eventually not enough for the voyeur, the lifeless, compliant mannequin will eventually fail to provide the emotional high this man requires. He will inevitably need a living, breathing person to push back, to show real fear, so he can experience the ultimate high of overcoming their will. When faced with someone who commits these kinds of acts, society often wants to write them off as insane, claiming they are driven by uncontrollable compulsions that they simply cannot help themselves due to their tragic pasts. We must reject this notion entirely. There is a concept in law enforcement known as the policeman at the elbow. If a uniformed officer were standing right next to this man in his garage, would he drag a victim inside? If a police cruiser were parked on the street, would the voyeur slide the window open? Absolutely not. He would wait. He would smile, make polite conversation, and delay his gratification for days, weeks, or months until the conditions were perfectly safe for him to act. That delay is the ultimate proof of choice. They are not compelled by a blind, uncontrollable madness. They choose their moments. They choose their victims. They choose to manipulate, dominate, and control because it is the only mechanism they have found that temporarily cures their crushing sense of worthlessness. They do it because it makes them feel good. The journey from a powerless, neglected child to a fully realized predator is paved with these dark, deliberate choices. As the feedback loop tightens and the fantasies demand more oxygen, the offender looks for a broader stage to test their developing skills. But before they are bold enough to place their hands directly on a human victim and look them in the eye, many of them decide to test their godlike power from a safe distance. They seek to manipulate society on a grand scale, hiding in plain sight, using the ultimate element of chaos to assert their dominance over the world. Chapter 3. The Spark of Destruction. Consider for a moment the profound power held within a single, fragile match. It is nothing more than a tiny sliver of wood tipped with a drop of phosphorus. In the hands of a responsible person, it represents warmth, light, and survival. But in the hands of a developing predator, that small wooden stick is a magic wand. It is an instrument of supreme manipulation that forces the entire world to stop what it is doing and pay attention. When we seek to understand the anatomy of a destructive mind, we must look very closely at those who choose to play with fire. The individuals who use arson as their weapon of choice offer us a terrifying, crystal-clear window into the psychology of a specific type of offender. A person driven by a desperate need for absolute power, yet paralyzed by an equally profound sense of cowardice. To understand the fire starter, we must first understand a vital distinction in human behavior. When we analyze violent individuals, we generally divide them into two broad categories: externalizers and internalizers. The externalizer is the person who acts on their dark fantasies directly and intimately. If they want to exert power, they will force a confrontation. They will use their physical presence, a weapon, or their sheer terrifying will to dominate another human being face to face. They want to see the fear in their victim's eyes, to feel the physical resistance and overcome it. The internalizer is entirely different. The internalizer is a loner, an asocial ghost who is fundamentally terrified of direct human confrontation. He lacks the interpersonal skills, the physical courage, or the basic nerve to look a victim in the eye and demand submission. He wants to strike out at a society that he feels has rejected him, but he is too fearful of the pushback. He needs to put a massive physical and emotional barrier between himself and the devastation he causes. He wants to be a god, but he wants to rule from the shadows. Arson is the ultimate crime of the internalizer. It allows a deeply inadequate person to launch a devastating attack and then quietly retreat into the crowd to watch his handiwork unfold. Imagine a young man working a dead-end job as a nighttime security guard at a sprawling, empty industrial park. He wears a cheap uniform with a plastic badge that mimics the authority of a police officer, but everyone who walks past him knows he has no real power. He is ignored by the executives who work in the buildings he protects. He is rejected by the women he tries to speak to. He goes home to an empty apartment, stewing in a toxic soup of resentment and grandiosity. He firmly believes he is brilliant, a man of immense potential, yet the world stubbornly treats him like a nobody. The cognitive dissonance is crushing him. One evening, unable to bear the heavy cloak of his own invisibility any longer, he gathers a pile of oily rags and cardboard in a dumpster behind a vacant warehouse. He flicks a disposable lighter, touches the flame to the frayed edge of the cardboard and quickly walks away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He retreats to the edge of the property and waits in the darkness. Within 20 minutes, his entire reality shifts. The night is torn apart by the shrieking wail of sirens. Massive, gleaming red fire engines roar into the lot, their tires screaming on the asphalt. Dozens of highly trained men in heavy turnout gear leap from the trucks, shouting urgent orders, unrolling heavy canvas hoses, and battling the towering inferno that has now consumed the dumpster and is licking at the brick wall of the warehouse. The local news team arrives, setting up bright camera lights to broadcast the chaos to the entire city. And standing in the shadows, holding his cheap flashlight, the night watchman experiences an intoxicating, unparalleled rush of euphoria. He realizes a profound truth. He made all of this happen. With a flick of his thumb, he commanded the emergency resources of an entire municipality. He forced the fire chief, the police, and the media to dance to a tune that he wrote. For that one glowing hour, he is no longer a forgotten loser. He is the invisible master of the universe. This is the addictive trap of the internalizer. That single act of nuisance arson floods his brain with a sense of control he has never achieved in any other aspect of his life. But like any addiction, the high eventually fades, and the tolerance builds. A dumpster fire will not satisfy him for long. He needs a bigger response. He needs a louder siren. He begins to study the response times of the local fire departments. He buys a police scanner and listens to the emergency dispatch frequencies in his bedroom. He learns the language of the authorities, obsessing over their tactics. He escalates. He targets an abandoned lumberyard, then a vacant church. He begins setting multiple fires in a single night, a psychological taunt designed to stretch the city's resources to the breaking point. He will wait until the fire engines leave a station to respond to his first blaze, and then he will immediately set a second fire right next to the empty station. This is his way of mocking the authorities, proving his intellectual superiority. He is playing a grand, deadly game of chess, and he believes he is winning. But a terrifying psychological shift is occurring. As his confidence grows, the empty buildings are no longer enough to feed his ego. The escalation demands a higher stake. He begins to target occupied structures. He sets a fire in the stairwell of a crowded apartment building in the dead of night. He torches a residential home while a family sleeps inside. When we see this leap, we are witnessing the ultimate horror of the internalizer's mind. He does not necessarily harbor a specific personal hatred for the family sleeping in that house. To him, they are not even human beings. They have been entirely depersonalized. They are simply props on his stage, necessary collateral damage in his quest to create a spectacular special effect. If they die in the flames, it only amplifies his sense of ultimate life and death power. When investigators are tasked with hunting down a serial arsonist of this magnitude, they do not look for a criminal mastermind. They look for the behavioral footprint of profound inadequacy masked by extreme vanity. They look for a man who is obsessed with his own public image, who dresses meticulously, but perhaps neglects basic personal hygiene because his internal life is in such disarray. They look for the pseudo-authority figure, the man who applied to be a police officer or a firefighter, but washed out of the academy because he could not handle the discipline or the psychological evaluation. They also look to the crowd, The arsonist's need for validation is so overwhelming that he almost always returns to the scene of his crime. He wants to stand among the panicked neighbors and watch the flames. He wants to hear the awe in their voices. He may even approach the police lines, offering to help direct traffic or provide a witness statement, desperate to inject himself into the official narrative. He will meticulously cut out every newspaper article written about his fires, pasting them into a hidden scrapbook that serves as his twisted resume of accomplishments. Catching this type of predator requires turning his own psychology against him. Because he is driven by vanity and a need for recognition, investigators will often use the media to flush him out. They might hold a press conference where they intentionally downplay the sophistication of the fires, subtly mocking the arsonist as an amateur. This strikes directly at his fragile ego. Infuriated that his brilliance is not being recognized, he will often make a mistake. He will escalate too quickly, set a fire in broad daylight, or return to a scene to leave a taunting note, ultimately providing the very clue that leads to his capture. When the handcuffs finally click around his wrists, the illusion completely shatters. Stripped of his matches and his shadows, the godlike manipulator is reduced back to exactly what he always was, a small, angry, deeply terrified human being who could only find worth in the ashes of other people's lives. We must always remember that the desire to destroy from a distance is the ultimate manifestation of cowardice. It is the wrath of the impotent. But fire, as devastating as it is only one tool available to the internalizer. Once a mind realizes that it can cause massive societal panic without ever having to look a victim in the eye, the avenues for destruction multiply. The need to manipulate and control from behind a curtain can evolve into forms of terror that are even more insidious, even more hidden, and entirely woven into the mundane fabric of our everyday lives. Chapter 4. The Illusion of Influence. We are, at our very core, a storytelling species. From the earliest days of human history, huddled around fires in the darkness, we have used narratives to make sense of the world, to entertain ourselves, and to explore the boundaries of our own morality. Today, those fires have been replaced by the glowing screens in our living rooms, the grand projections of the cinema, and the endless digital feeds we carry in our pockets. We immerse ourselves in tales of heroism and heartbreak, of thrilling heists and terrifying crimes. But a deeply troubling question arises when the violence we consume as fiction suddenly spills over into the harsh reality of our daily lives. When an unspeakable act perfectly mirrors a scene from a popular film or a best-selling novel, society immediately points a finger at the story. We want to believe that the screen holds a hypnotic, corrupting power. We want an easy scapegoat. We desperately want to believe that the story created the monster. But if we are going to look honestly at the anatomy of human motivation, we must strip away this comforting illusion. We must confront the uncomfortable truth that media, no matter how violent, graphic, or disturbing, does not possess the magical ability to reach into the mind of a normal, well-adjusted human being and flip a switch that turns them into a predator. The screen is not a generator of darkness. It is merely a mirror. It only reflects and gives shape to what is already lurking in the mind of the viewer. To understand this dynamic, imagine a teenage boy standing in a courtroom facing a lifetime behind bars. A few months earlier, he and a friend broke into the home of an elderly neighbor, knowing she kept cash hidden in a desk drawer. It was supposed to be a simple, victimless theft, but the neighbor returned home early and caught them in the act. Panic set in. The teenager, acting on pure, adrenaline-fueled impulse, grabbed a heavy brass lamp and struck the woman, killing her. When the trial begins, the defense attorney mounts a passionate, highly publicized campaign claiming the boy is innocent by reason of media intoxication. He argues that the teenager was hopelessly addicted to a brutally violent, hyper-realistic video game. The attorney claims the game hypnotized the boy, blurring the lines between digital fantasy and reality, effectively conditioning him to strike out violently without conscious thought. It is an incredibly compelling narrative and one that preys on the fears of every parent. But when we look at the actual behavior, the illusion crumbles. If this boy were truly hypnotized by violence, acting as an unthinking automaton driven by digital bloodlust, why did he break into an empty house to steal cash? His initial motive had absolutely nothing to do with mimicking a violent game. His motive was pure, simple greed. He wanted money, and he chose a vulnerable target to get it. When he was surprised by the homeowner, he did not strike her because a video game commanded him to do so. He struck her because he was a coward, cornered and terrified of the consequences of his own theft, and he chose to use lethal force to silence the only witness. The video game did not create his greed, nor did it create his cowardly willingness to take a life to save his own skin. It merely provided a convenient, socially acceptable excuse for his own horrifying choices. This is not to say that the stories we consume have zero impact on criminal behavior. They have a massive impact, but not in the way society assumes. Media does not supply the motive, but it can absolutely provide the blueprint. Imagine two deeply hardened, incredibly dangerous men planning an armed robbery of a high-end jewelry exchange. These are not impulsive teenagers. They are organized, predatory adults who have already decided they are willing to kill anyone who gets in their way. They are sitting in a dark living room meticulously planning their crime when a late-night thriller comes on the television. In the movie, a brilliant cinematic villain dispatches his victims not with a gun or a knife, but by forcing them to ingest a highly specific, exotic industrial solvent that mimics a heart attack and leaves no immediate forensic trace. The two men watch the screen, completely captivated. They do not watch this film and suddenly decide to become murderers. The murderous intent was already firmly established in their minds long before they turned on the television. What the movie provides is a tactical solution. It offers them a clean, quiet, and seemingly foolproof method to execute their dark desires. They adopt the cinematic method, procuring the solvent and using it exactly as depicted on screen. When they are eventually caught, it is easy to look at the bizarre nature of the crime and blame the movie. But the film was merely an instructional manual for men who were already enrolled in a deadly curriculum. The darkness was already fully formed. The screen just gave it a specific shape. We see this same phenomenon of borrowed inspiration in crimes of pure financial enterprise. Consider the release of a blockbuster suspense novel about a brilliant hacker who infiltrates the municipal water supply of a major city, threatening to poison the reservoirs unless a massive ransom is paid. The book dominates the bestseller lists, praised for its terrifying plausibility. Within weeks of its publication, the mayor's office of a real city receives an almost identical threat, demanding millions of dollars to prevent the exact same catastrophe described in the novel. Did the novel twist a normal, law-abiding citizen into a terrorist? Absolutely not. A well-adjusted person reads a thriller, enjoys the adrenaline rush from the safety of their armchair, and puts the book back on the shelf. But a criminally minded individual, someone already motivated by immense greed and a total lack of empathy, reads the exact same book and sees a highly lucrative, low-risk business model. They see a scheme that allows them to exert massive societal pressure without ever having to engage in a physical confrontation. The author of the novel simply did the creative heavy lifting for an extortionist who was already looking for a way to strike. This illusion of influence extends far beyond the commission of the crime itself. For the most dangerous predators, the media remains a tool of manipulation long after they have been caught and locked inside a prison cell. Many serial offenders are consumed by a profound, unquenchable narcissism. They crave the spotlight, desperate to be recognized as the brilliant masterminds they believe themselves to be. From behind bars, they will write eloquent, philosophical letters to major newspapers. They will grant exclusive television interviews playing the role of the remorseful sinner seeking redemption, or the misunderstood genius who was a victim of an unfair society. They use reporters and journalists to broadcast their voices, trying to control the narrative of their own lives and keep themselves relevant. They understand that society is fascinated by the macabre, and they feed on that fascination, using the press to exert a twisted form of control over the public from inside a maximum security facility. If we are not careful, if we do not recognize this behavior for the pure, unadulterated manipulation that it is, we end up giving these individuals the exact platform they crave. We must hold the line on personal responsibility. We live in a world saturated with dark narratives, violent imagery, and terrifying fiction. But a story cannot force a hand to pull a trigger. A movie cannot compel a mind to shatter a life. The true origin of violence always resides in the choices made by the individual. When we blame the screen, we surrender our understanding of human agency. We must accept that there are individuals who walk among us who have chosen a path of destruction, who have cultivated a profound emptiness, and who will use any tool available to them, whether it is a weapon, a poison, or a script borrowed from a Hollywood thriller, to fulfill their deeply held need to dominate and destroy. And as we peer deeper into the shadows of human motivation, we must turn our attention to those who seek to cause this destruction, not with a loud, violent confrontation, but with a quiet, invisible, and devastatingly lethal touch. We must look at the minds of those who weaponize our most basic human trust, turning the everyday items we bring into our homes into instruments of profound terror. Chapter 5. The Silent Threat. There is a particular kind of terror that strikes at the very heart of human society, a fear so profound that it bypasses our conscious thoughts and settles into our collective unconscious. It is the fear that the very things we rely upon for our daily survival, the medicine we take for a simple headache, the food we share at our tables, have been quietly turned against us. When we discuss individuals who engage in product tampering or mass poisoning, we are looking at the most cowardly manifestation of the internalizer's mind. These individuals have moved beyond the need for personal confrontation. They have achieved the ultimate cold-blooded ambition to hold an entire society hostage without ever needing to look their victims in the eye. To understand the motive of a person who would lace a consumer product with poison, we must look for a personality that is fundamentally disconnected from the human experience. While most crimes of violence, as horrifying as they are, involve some form of emotional friction or direct physical contact, product tampering is the ultimate act of depersonalization. The offender does not hate the individuals they kill. They often do not even know them. The victims are merely pawns in a grand, twisted game of power. The motive is rarely about the specific object being poisoned. It is about the panic the act creates, the authority it forces to react, and the feeling of intellectual superiority that comes from hiding a deadly secret in plain sight. Consider the aftermath of a massive poisoning event. A city is thrown into chaos, store shelves are cleared, national manufacturers are forced into emergency recalls, and millions of people suddenly feel a chilling vulnerability in their own kitchens. The tamperer, sitting safely at home, consumes every scrap of media coverage. They watch the news reports, read the agonizing accounts of grieving families, and listen to the frantic briefings from law enforcement. They feel a surge of ego that is entirely disproportionate to their actual place in the world. They have caused this. They have forced the system to its knees. This type of offender is almost always a deeply frustrated individual who feels that society has systematically undervalued them. They are not masterminds. They are usually individuals with a long, consistent history of personal and professional failure. They have likely cycled through multiple jobs, always convinced that they are the smartest person in the room, yet always finding themselves fired for inability to cooperate with coworkers or supervisors. Their rage is a quiet, simmering, and internalizing force. They have tried to express their grievances through official channels, writing endless, pompous letters to officials or corporations, demanding changes that no one ever implements. When those letters go ignored, they conclude that the world is broken, and they resolve to break it back. When we hunt this kind of predator, we do not look for the typical signs of criminal sophistication. We look for a trail of resentment. We look for someone who possesses a basic, functional intelligence, enough to understand how to adulterate a product safely, but whose personality is defined by a deep-seated feeling of impotence. They are individuals who desperately want to play a major role in the drama of their city, but have been relegated to the wings. Poisoning is their way of finally stepping onto the center stage. But there is a secondary motive that is often even more dangerous, and that is the motive of greed masked as a random act of terror. Sometimes the tampering is not driven by a vague desire to punish society, but by a very specific, cold, and calculated plan for financial gain. Imagine a person in a desperate, crumbling financial situation, deep in debt, perhaps facing the total loss of their home and status. They are not a random actor. They have a specific target in mind, someone they need to remove to collect an insurance payout or to secure an inheritance. But if they simply kill this person, they know the investigation will focus immediately on them. They know they are the primary suspect. They need to create a narrative that suggests their victim was the casualty of a random societal tragedy. They choose a product that their victim is known to use daily. They take the time to acquire the poison, carefully learning how to introduce it into the capsules or the food without leaving any evidence. They make their move. When the victim falls ill and dies, the offender is the first one to call the police, the first one to express their total shock, and the first one to suggest that this must be part of the same mysterious random poisoning series that has been in the news. This is an act of supreme callousness. The offender is willing to see the world burn just to protect their own small, self-serving interest. They count on the fact that authorities will be so overwhelmed by the sheer scale of a public terror event that the quiet, intimate murder of their target will be swallowed by the statistics. They are counting on the fact that law enforcement will be looking for a shadow, not a spouse or a relative. However, they almost always fail for one critical reason: the nature of their own greed. To make the ruse work, to collect the payout, they often find themselves needing to repeat the act, or they become so focused on the financial goal that they become careless. They keep evidence they should have destroyed. They spend money they should have hidden. They leave a trail of behavioral breadcrumbs that lead directly back to their front door. They forget that even the most carefully constructed lie has to be maintained in the physical world, and the physical world is unforgiving. In these investigations, we learn that the most dangerous individuals are not the ones who act out of a sudden, explosive rage. They are the ones who can plan. They are the ones who can sit at a kitchen table, read a textbook on human anatomy or toxicology, and calmly prepare to snuff out a human life for a few $1,000s or a plot of land. We must also recognize that these individuals are experts at projecting an image of the good citizen. They are often active in their communities, well regarded by their neighbors, and perfectly capable of maintaining the appearance of a stable life while they carry out the most horrific schemes in secret. They rely on our innate human bias. We want to believe that the person who brings cookies to the office or waves at us from their driveway is incapable of the unthinkable. But in the anatomy of motive, we must learn to separate the appearance from the behavior. When we uncover the truth behind these silent threats, we are reminded of a chilling reality. The greatest dangers we face are often those that look exactly like us. They are not the monsters of our nightmares. They are the people who have allowed their resentment, their narcissism, or their greed to erode their connection to the humanity of others until they are left with nothing but their own cold, singular agenda. Understanding them requires us to look past the mask, to listen to what their actions are really saying, and to realize that the most lethal poison is often not the substance in the capsule but the motive that placed it there. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. We have all felt the crushing weight of the pressure cooker. It is that specific, localized agony where the demands of our lives, our professional obligations, our personal failures, our internal insecurities begin to compress us into a space so small that we can barely draw a breath. For the vast majority of people, this is a transient state. We vent the steam, we talk to friends, we seek counseling, we change our environment, or we simply endure until the crisis passes. But for the individual who has allowed their sense of worth to become entirely tethered to a rigid, fragile image of success, the pressure does not dissipate. It builds until something inside them finally snaps. When we examine the minds of those who walk into their own workplace and commit an act of catastrophic violence, we are rarely looking at a person who was driven by a sudden, inexplicable bout of madness. We are almost always looking at a person who has spent months or even years meticulously constructing a narrative of victimhood. This individual does not see themselves as an employee, they see themselves as a martyr. They believe that they are the only person who truly understands the work, the only person who is truly dedicated, and they are convinced that everyone else, their co-workers, their supervisors, the entire organizational structure, is actively conspiring to diminish them. This person is a master of the paper trail. They do not just have grievances, they have documentation. They are the ones who spend hours drafting long, calm, and business-like letters of complaint, cataloging every slight, every missed promotion, and every perceived injustice. To them, these documents are not just complaints. They are a formal indictment of their environment. They believe they are playing by the rules, expecting that if they present their case logically enough, the world will finally recognize their talent and reward them. When the organization fails to validate their worldview, when a supervisor denies a request or a coworker is promoted, it is not seen as a simple professional disagreement. It is interpreted as a direct personal assault. The transition from a disgruntled employee to a lethal threat occurs in the quiet spaces between their failures. They begin to withdraw. The colleague who used to participate in office small talk stops speaking altogether. Their physical appearance may shift. They might become markedly unkempt. Or perhaps they begin to exhibit a strange, newfound rigidity in their routine. They become obsessed with their own perceived grievances, to the exclusion of all other interests. At this stage, they are essentially living in an echo chamber of their own construction, where every minor interaction is filtered through a lens of paranoid resentment. When we investigate the aftermath of such a tragedy, we often find that the organization was actually trying to do the right thing. We find managers who held meetings, human resources departments that offered leaves of absence, and colleagues who attempted to reach out with genuine empathy. But the person who has snapped is no longer capable of receiving help. Their reality has become so distorted that even an act of kindness is perceived as a patronizing gesture. They have decided that the system is not just incompetent, it is corrupt, and in their warped logic, the only way to fix the system is to tear it down. These individuals are not seeking money or fame. They are seeking a final, violent moment of validation. They target their supervisors and co-workers not because they hate them as individuals, but because those people are the physical embodiments of the injustice they have suffered. They have often spent weeks or months visualizing the act. They have scouted the building, they have obsessed over firearms, and they have rehearsed exactly how they will deliver their final message. When they finally commit the act, they are often perfectly calm. The explosion of violence is not a loss of control. For them, it is the first time they have felt in complete control of their entire existence. The most terrifying truth about these individuals is how often they appear to be getting better right before they strike. They may return from a stress-related leave of absence and appear remarkably composed. They may become quiet, almost robotic in their efficiency. We want to believe this means they are recovering, but in reality, they have simply made their decision. The mental agony of the internal struggle has been replaced by the cold, singular focus of the mission. They have stopped fighting the world and started planning the exit. Protecting an organization from someone who is intent on snapping is an incredibly difficult challenge because it requires us to move beyond the traditional metrics of performance. We have to become students of behavior. We have to look for the person whose life is no longer in balance. This does not mean we treat everyone with a grievance as a suspect. That would be a total failure of empathy and leadership. But it does mean we must create environments where people feel heard long before their grievances become an obsession. We must train managers to look for the shift. Is the person who was once vocal now silent? Is the person who once accepted feedback now viewing every correction as a personal attack? Is there a pattern of isolation that wasn't there before? We need to have resources that are truly accessible, where someone can go to get help without fearing for their career. But we also need to have the courage to acknowledge when help is no longer sufficient. When an individual has moved from expressing a grievance to threatening the safety of the collective, the focus must immediately shift from helping the individual to protecting the community. These tragedies are not the result of a monster among us. They are the result of a human being who has become trapped in a self-constructed prison of their own resentment and who has lost the ability to see the humanity of the people they work with. They have traded their capacity for growth for the fleeting, lethal rush of retribution. Our only defense against this darkness is a culture of genuine vigilance, a culture that cares enough to notice the changes in those around us, and that has the fortitude to act before the pressure finally becomes too much to bear. Chapter 7. The Psychology of Evasion. When a person chooses to step over the line and commit an act that destroys their life and the lives of others, they are essentially walking into a new, dark reality. But for the small percentage of these individuals who decide they are not going to face the consequences, the crime is merely the prologue. The story then shifts, transforming into a desperate, high-stakes game of shadows. When we look at the mind of a fugitive, we are not looking at a person who is simply running away. We are looking at a person who is attempting to perform the ultimate psychological act of denial. They are trying to outrun their own nature. The way an offender behaves on the run is, in itself, a definitive map of their personality. Just as the crime scene tells us who they were at the moment of the act, the path of their flight tells us who they are at the moment of their survival. We generally classify fugitives into two categories, the organized and the disorganized. These labels are not merely about whether they packed a suitcase or mapped out a route. They are about the offender's capacity for self-control, their ability to plan, and their fundamental level of criminal sophistication. A disorganized fugitive is a person who has snapped under the weight of their own inadequacy. Their flight is chaotic, frantic, and entirely reactive. They do not have a plan because they did not have a plan for their life, and they certainly did not have a plan for the aftermath of their crime. They move in erratic bursts, often staying in their own comfort zone, the geographical area where they have lived or worked, because they lack the cognitive map to visualize a life anywhere else. They leave a trail of breadcrumbs so obvious that it would be comical if it were not for the horrific nature of their actions. They use their own names, they visit people from their past, and they maintain their old habits because they do not have the intellectual or emotional capacity to reinvent themselves. For the disorganized fugitive, the flight is not a strategy. It is a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The organized fugitive is a much more chilling proposition. They are the individuals who have spent their lives rehearsing this moment in their own fantasies. They have often been preparing for flight long before the crime was ever committed. They have carefully acquired the necessary tools, multiple identities, illicit funds, and a deep understanding of how to move across borders without triggering alarms. Their flight is methodical. They do not look for a place to hide. They look for a new place to exert control. When we profile an organized fugitive, we look for a personality that has been practicing for this exit their entire life. We look for individuals who have always been comfortable as outsiders, who never truly integrated into their local community, and who have the linguistic, social, or professional skills to blend into entirely new environments. These are the people who can walk into a new city, adopt a new name, build a new career, and, most terrifyingly, build a new life with a new partner, all while the authorities are still hunting for the ghost they left behind. The most common mistake society makes is assuming that a fugitive on the run is miserable. We imagine them cowering in dark motels, jumping at every siren, and dying of loneliness. But for the highly organized predator, flight can be the most exhilarating experience of their life. For the first time, they are truly in charge. They have successfully shed the life that they felt was a failure and have started fresh. They are playing a game of wits against the world's most sophisticated law enforcement agencies, and as long as they are not caught, they feel like they are winning. Their narcissism is fed by their success at evasion. However, even the most organized fugitive is held captive by their own nature. We almost always see that they return to the familiar. They may change their name, they may dye their hair, and they may move to the other side of the planet, but they cannot escape the patterns that defined their criminal life. If they were a person who enjoyed exerting control over women in their previous life, they will inevitably seek out the same power dynamics in their new life. If they were a person who used their intelligence to manipulate financial systems, they will eventually find a way to manipulate their new environment. They are fundamentally unable to change because the very personality traits that drove them to commit the crime are the same traits they are using to manage their flight. The fugitive's ultimate undoing is almost always their own pride. They cannot stand to be anonymous forever. They want someone to know who they are, or at least to know how clever they have been. They will eventually reach out. They will visit a library to check the news from their old hometown. They will call a family member they think they can trust. They will seek out a new audience to perform for. They are constantly looking for a mirror to reflect their own importance, and that mirror is the very thing that the authorities use to find them. When a fugitive is finally caught, it is rarely due to a cinematic shootout or a high-speed chase. It is usually the result of a quiet, methodical process where the investigator realizes that the fugitive is essentially a prisoner of their own behavioral patterns. We realize that they are not moving randomly. They are moving toward what they believe is their rightful place in the world. The hunt for a fugitive is not just a search for a person. It is a search for the truth of their character. We look at the empty spaces they left behind, the lies they told to those closest to them, and the trail of discarded relationships. We are trying to understand not just where they have gone, but who they have become in the silence of their evasion. And invariably we find that the person they are running from is not the police. They are running from the reality of their own internal emptiness, a vacuum that no amount of distance, new names, or new lives can ever truly fill. Chapter 8. The Fixated Mind. There exists a distinct class of individuals who exist in the periphery of our lives, often mistaken for harmless eccentrics or overzealous enthusiasts, but who operate under an internal mandate that is profoundly dangerous. We must turn our attention to the fixated mind, the stalker, the obsessive, the person who has chosen one specific human being to be the center of their reality. Unlike the predator who seeks power through random chaos or the arsonist who seeks it through invisible destruction, the fixated individual is driven by a singular, consuming grievance. They have decided that their own life's meaning is entirely dependent on the presence, the submission, or the destruction of a specific other. When we analyze the anatomy of a fixated mind, we are looking at the ultimate extreme of personalization. For these individuals, the world does not exist as a collection of people and events. It exists as a narrative where they are the hero, or perhaps the tragic, misunderstood victim, and their target is the key to their salvation or their downfall. The obsession often begins in a place of perceived rejection. Perhaps the fixated individual once had a fleeting interaction with their target, a professional meeting, a brief conversation, even a total misunderstanding of a friendly gesture, and they have built an entire edifice of meaning on that single, fragile foundation. They believe they have a connection that everyone else is too blind to see. The fixation follows a predictable, escalating timeline. It begins with the stage of surveillance. They are not simply watching, they are studying. They learn the target's habits, their route to work, the people they spend their time with, and the specific rhythms of their daily life. This surveillance provides the fixated person with a sense of intimate knowledge that they use to justify their behavior. In their own minds, they believe they are the only person who truly understands the target, and this understanding grants them a sense of ownership. They are no longer a stranger. They are a silent, constant presence in the target's life. As the fixation intensifies, the behavior moves from observation to intervention. They begin to send messages, notes, gifts, or endless digital communications that are designed to test the target's reaction. If the target ignores them, the fixated individual does not take it as a rejection. They interpret it as a test of their commitment, or they imagine that someone else is standing in the way of their connection. They begin to create a reality where they and the target are a pair, and any outside influence, a spouse, a partner, or even a professional colleague, is viewed as an intruder who must be removed. The true danger of the fixated mind lies in its total lack of empathy. Because the target has been elevated to the status of an object in the fixated person's internal fantasy, the target's humanity is effectively erased. They are no longer a person with feelings, desires, or the right to self-determination. They are a prize to be won, a secret to be guarded, or a source of pain to be punished. When the fixated individual finally moves to act, they are often perfectly convinced that they are acting out of love or out of a desperate, righteous necessity. They will often tell the authorities, or even the target themselves, that they would never hurt them, even while they are taking the steps that will inevitably lead to violence. We see this frequently in the behavior of those who harbor a delusional, obsessive love. They have constructed a life where the target is their reason for existence. When the target inevitably rejects this fantasy, the fixated person experiences a psychic break that is every bit as devastating as a physical injury. To their mind, the rejection is not just a personal slight, it is a declaration of war. They cannot accept a reality where they do not exist in the target's life, so they decide that if they cannot be the center of that life, they will be the thing that brings it to an end. When we are called to intervene in a case of fixation, we do not look for the perpetrator's anger, we look for their persistence. These individuals are defined by their inability to let go. They are not deterred by police warnings, restraining orders, or direct confrontations. To them, these are merely obstacles to be navigated. The only way to effectively handle a fixated mind is through the total, absolute, and unyielding withdrawal of any feedback. The fixated person is a fire that requires the oxygen of the target's attention, whether that attention is positive or negative, to continue burning. Even the target's fear is a form of fuel. The tragic reality is that the fixated mind often operates outside the traditional legal framework until it is too late. Because they are not committing crimes in the classic sense during the early stages of their obsession, they often fall through the cracks of our justice system. They may spend months sending harmless-looking letters, showing up at public events, or simply being present in the target's life. It is only when the fantasy is definitively shattered, or when the obsession reaches a point of internal saturation, that the violence manifests. To protect those who are targeted by a fixated mind, we must learn to recognize the escalation before it crosses the line into tragedy. we must recognize that persistent, unwanted, and irrational attention is a precursor to violence, not a nuisance to be tolerated. We must treat the obsessive's attempts to bridge the distance as a genuine threat. The fixated individual is a person who has lost their ability to participate in the shared reality of the world, and until we understand that their internal mandate is non-negotiable, we will continue to underestimate the danger they pose. They are not waiting for an opportunity, they are creating one, and they are doing so with the terrifying, single-minded focus of someone who has nothing left but the object of their obsession. Chapter 9. The Chaos Principle. In the study of violent human behavior, there is a category of crime that defies the traditional search for logical motive. It is the realm of the spree killer, the individual who erupts into a community or a crowded space and unleashes a storm of indiscriminate destruction. When we look at the wreckage of such an event, we often feel a sense of utter bewilderment. We see that the victims were chosen not because of who they were, but simply because they were there. The tragedy feels random, chaotic, and entirely senseless. Yet, if we are to understand the anatomy of motive, we must push past the feeling of chaos to find the internal logic that drives the perpetrator. For the spree killer, the act of violence is not an end, it is an endgame strategy. The spree killer is typically an individual who has lived a life of perceived marginalization. Unlike the predator who hunts in the shadows or the internalizer who seeks power through deception, the spree killer has reached a state of total emotional exhaustion. They have spent years, perhaps their entire lives, accumulating grievances, perceived insults, and failures. They have reached a point where they feel the world has offered them no exit, no opportunity, and no recognition. They have concluded that the society around them is fundamentally broken, and they feel they are the only ones who can see the truth. This individual is not planning for a future. They have already checked out of reality. When they decide to go on a spree, they have often made a silent, internal commitment that they will not leave the scene of their crime alive. They are not interested in escape, they are not interested in negotiation, and they are not interested in being understood. They are interested in a final dramatic statement. They want to force the world to stop and look at their pain, and they want to punish the collective entity of society for failing to save them. The victims in a spree killing are incidental. This is the hardest reality for us to accept, because we want to believe that there is a why connected to the lives that were taken. But to the spree killer, the individuals in the building, the school, or the street are not people. They are members of a system that has ignored them. They are symbols of the world that has wronged them. Because they have depersonalized their own lives, they find it incredibly easy to depersonalize the lives of others. They are not hunting individuals, they are attacking a collective. The precipitating stressor, the event that finally triggers the spree, is often something that, to the rest of the world, seems relatively minor. It could be a final notice from a landlord, a breakup, or a harsh word from a coworker. But to the spree killer, this is the breaking of the camel's back. It is the final undeniable proof that the world is indifferent to their existence. They have been waiting for a reason to let go of the last remnants of their social contract, and this event provides the catalyst. There is a terrifying element of performative power in these events. The killer knows that as soon as the violence begins, they become the most important person in the world for that brief window of time. They know that every emergency vehicle in the city will be heading toward them. They know that news cameras will be broadcasting their actions to millions of people. For a man who has lived a life of total obscurity and irrelevance, this is the ultimate seductive allure. They are finally the director of their own narrative, and they are ensuring that their finale is impossible to ignore. Law enforcement professionals know that the only way to manage such a situation is to immediately recognize the killer's need for an endgame. This is why negotiators are trained to identify if they are dealing with a person who intends to survive or a person who has already decided to die. If the individual has no intention of leaving the scene alive, standard negotiation tactics designed to encourage surrender are often useless. The killer is not interested in promises or solutions. They are interested in maintaining their stage. This is why we often see these situations end in what we call suicide by cop, a final, desperate act where the perpetrator forces law enforcement to take the life they no longer have the will to live. The most chilling aspect of the spree killer is that they are not acting out of a sudden surge of insanity. They are acting out of a deeply rooted, long-term despair. They have meticulously planned their final act as a way to settle their internal ledger. They believe that by inflicting the maximum amount of pain on their surroundings, they are balancing the scales for the pain they have endured throughout their lives. We cannot prevent every such tragedy because we cannot monitor the internal monologue of every disillusioned person in our society. But we can begin to recognize the pattern of the end game. We can look for the person who has begun to systematically dismantle their own connections to the world, the person who gives away their possessions, who begins to say final goodbyes, and who has stopped talking about a future. When we see a person who has stopped imagining a life beyond the current moment, we are witnessing the precursor to the chaos. The chaos principle is the final failure of the human spirit to engage with the reality of others. It is the moment when a person decides that the only way to validate their own existence is to destroy the existence of those around them. Understanding this does not offer us a simple solution, but it does offer us a shield. By recognizing the motives of those who feel they have nothing to lose, we become more capable of reaching them while they still believe they have something to gain. We must learn to see the despair before it manifests as violence, and we must understand that the random act of destruction is always, without exception, a deeply personal response to a deeply personal failure. Ciao. Chapter 10. The Ultimate Verdict. We have journeyed through the darkest corridors of the human experience, looking into the minds of those who choose to deviate from the social contract. We have seen how small, seemingly insignificant acts of cruelty can evolve into sophisticated campaigns of terror. We have traced the progression from the lonely child in a broken home to the adult who believes their only path to significance is through the destruction of others. We have dismantled the illusions of motiveless crime, the hypnotic power of the media, and the myth of the born monster. The ultimate verdict of our journey is both sobering and empowering. There is no such thing as a senseless crime. Every act, no matter how depraved, is a manifestation of an internal logic, a response to a perceived grievance, and a desperate failing attempt to exert power over a world that the offender believes has rejected them. The most vital lesson we must carry forward is the understanding of the why. Whenever we encounter a situation that seems chaotic, unpredictable, or terrifying, we must discipline ourselves to look for the patterns of personality. We must ask what the offender is trying to achieve, what they believe they are owed, and how they view themselves in relation to the rest of humanity. By doing so, we transform our fear into a form of objective knowledge. We move from being passive observers of horror to being active participants in our own protection. The people who commit these acts rely on our ignorance. They rely on the fact that we will see their crimes as random tragedies rather than as the inevitable results of their internal developmental paths. They rely on our tendency to look away, to rationalize, and to treat their destructive behavior as a mysterious anomaly rather than a predictable outcome of their own choices. But when we understand their motive, we strip away their power to surprise us. We see them not as mythical figures of pure evil, but as individuals whose lives have been defined by a profound inability to connect with the shared reality of the world. We also see the vital importance of the human element. Time and again, we have seen that the most effective interventions, the ones that saved lives and prevented the pressure cooker from exploding, were not the results of grand institutional policies, but the results of individuals who were brave enough to pay attention. They were the co-workers who noticed a subtle change in behavior, the parents who sought help when their child began to display dangerous patterns, and the investigators who had the insight to look past the smoke and find the person who was actually holding the match. We cannot delegate our security to a system. We are the system. Our collective vigilance, rooted in a deep understanding of human behavior, is the most powerful tool we possess. As you reflect on these insights, remember that the goal is not to live in a state of constant, paralyzing suspicion. That is the exact opposite of a healthy life. The goal is to live with a heightened awareness of the value of human connection. The majority of these destructive paths were paved with isolation, resentment, and the feeling that no one was watching, no one was listening, and no one truly cared. The antidote to that darkness is not found in more locks on our doors. It is found in the way we engage with one another. It is found in the strength of our communities, the depth of our empathy, and our willingness to notice when someone in our midst is beginning to drift away. We have spent our time staring into the abyss, and it is natural to want to look away. But the abyss is only frightening if we refuse to understand how it was formed. We now possess the language to describe the darkness, and in doing so we have taken the first step toward keeping it at bay. We are the keepers of our own shared reality. By remaining curious, by remaining vigilant, and by relentlessly pursuing the question of why, we ensure that the light of human reason and compassion remains the most powerful force in our lives. This is not just a study of crime, it is a study of life, and the ultimate verdict is that we have far more power to shape our world than we often dare to believe.